Which brings me to our two main guests. So, Martin Illingworth is an associate of independent thinking, has been for quite a while. Used to be an English and drama teacher, is now senior lecturer at Sheffield Hallam University. He wrote a book. His first book for us was Think Before You Teach. He's trying to encourage a higher level of professionalism in terms of thinking about what you do and how you do it. It's not just about delivering the curriculum. And then he wrote a book for us, which has been a couple of years in the making, called Forget School, which came out serendipitously just about a few weeks before the school closures. We know you're not officially closed, but before the school buildings closed down. So it has provoked a lot of interest and controversy, we must say, around this whole idea of why we should be forgetting school and what we should be doing instead. So we'll come to Martin just a little while, but then it also brings huge pleasure to introduce Graham Brown Martin, somebody I've known for a few years now, is a good friend to independent thinking. He's he bestrides the global educational stages of the world. He's a thorn in the side of many government and their ilk, who believe education is there's only one way of doing it. And he's got a really interesting view on global education systems. He wrote a book a while back called Learning Reimagined, which we'll talk to him about, different education systems. But he also has a view about the point and purpose and practice of education anyway, let alone with regard to what's going on with COVID and with the school closures and the technology. So I'm really excited to have these two people to talk about the point, purpose and future of education at a time where we can really examine that, and there is an opportunity to move it forward and change things. Let me start with Graham, really. Without going too far into political and socio-economic history, remember to use your short sentences, Graham. How have we got the education system we've got, especially in England, where numbers and winners seem to be what counts? So numbers, it's about the data, it's the performativity, it's what you can put in a spreadsheet. And winners, it's league tables, it's the fact that some people can get top grades and other people can't. It's numbers and winners seems to drive the education system from the top at the moment. How have we got there, briefly?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's because of preoccupation with measurement. There is this kind of overriding idea that if you can measure it, it counts. And I mean, that certainly, I think, was probably right in the last century. I mean, it's a nuanced conversation, but just for brevity, I'm going to be short, as you've asked. I mean, you go back to some of the original management consultants, like Frederick Taylor and Ketterley and so forth, that enabled us to make things at scale. Frederick Taylor in the sort of late 19th century, early 20th century, his ideas, his thinking around scale of operations, industrial scale of operations, transformed craft production into mass production. And we can argue about that, but actually, I mean, we live in homes and we have affordances that are, previous generations could never have imagined. So it wasn't all bad. But with that comes a whole series of practices in terms of measuring. And then if you measure, you can have KPIs around improving those measurements and so forth. And that became that sort of scientific management, that scientific thinking, the scientific method, around management. And I think that has migrated into the education structure, particularly on schools, but also to some extent universities. I mean, you only have to look at the sort of advice that's been given to successive governments over, many decades and the kind of organizations. So for example, McKinsey, the management consultancy, very much based on Taylor's work and everything else, is sort of measuring of everything. So Michael Barber, of course, was a chief advisor education advisor for McKinsey when he advised Tony Blair's administration, and then later this administration and so forth, and then became the chief education officer for a while of Pearson. Pearson, of course, have industrialized that education, commodified it. I mean, their business is about selling content and copyrights. Their business is about exploiting copyrights. And of course, they own the textbook industry pretty much for education, and also the measurement industry. I mean, that's an interesting thing, isn't it? How they determine the texts and then also the measurement to make sure the teacher has inculcated them correctly and that a child has remembered them for an arbitrary exam. And I think that's where we've ended up. And so But that has been going down. I mean, as I say, I mean, you know, it's nuanced, and I think you know it had worked for much of the last century. But as we move through this century, of course, you know, where machines do that far better, you know, AI, automation, and so forth. You know, we have to ask the question: is it right that we are training kids and learners of all ages to compete with machines in terms of memorizing content and as opposed to applying? Nothing wrong with knowledge, of course. It's how we apply it to interesting abstract challenges that we have today. So I think that's how we got here. Sorry, short sentence.
Yeah, okay, thank you. The performativity, yes, that's a good one. That was the shortest one. Well done. The assessment system and the stranglehold that has on, it's the tail wagging the dog, isn't it? I remember I was working in Hong Kong a while back. I was hosting Sugata Mitra, Professor Sugata Mitra, who the famous hole in the wall TED talk about letting children street children in India having access to a computer, and they taught themselves in so many ways. And one of the things he was suggesting is that he says the only reason the exam system can exist in its current form is by denying the existence of the internet. So that's, as soon as we let the internet in, we have to change the exam system, and the exam system doesn't want to be changed. It's making a lot of people a lot of money.
I mean, that's quite right, isn't it? I mean, you know, it's sort of interesting, isn't it? I mean, you know, I often quote, I was quoting in talks last year, you know, amazing milestone that computer scientists reached in the summer of last year, which was training an AI to pass an 8th grade science test. Which is, I mean, it is a milestone. I mean, it's, you know, passing not just standardized tests, but logic and all that kind of stuff. Very clever. And of course, the narrative around that in the media and indeed in education thought leaders was, wow, that means we can replace teachers with an AI, and AI can teach kids how to pass an 8th grade science test. And this is like really woolly headed. I mean, this is exactly the problem with the 4th industrial revolution. You know, looking at AI and automation through the lens of last century, when in reality, what that really meant was that the 8th grade science test is now obsolete. You know, what happens if a child goes into some form of assessment? And remember, assessment is not the same as measurement. You know, the language of education has been hijacked by bureaucrats and technocrats. You know, if you want to know if a child is learning, you don't need them to do a test. You just listen to them, talk to them, be with them. I mean, that's, you know, you don't, you know, that's if you know what they're learning. So the measurement is something else. It might be useful as a diagnostic test. I mean, you know, but what happens if the child then goes into a test or an assessment where they are working with the AI, which of course is what they will do in the real world, if they share their answers with their cohort, with their friends, whether they go online. I mean, what then, how would that then change both the assessment and also what and how we teach? I think is interesting. If we teach young people for the world in which they are entering, I mean, the Victorians did it. The Victorians used the technology of the day in their examinations. Why would we not use those platforms? Mm. I mean, I think that there's a question, and I think Sugata makes a valid point. I don't agree with everything he says, but I think he makes a point on that one.
Mm. I think I wrote something about testing is the educational device loved most by the people who know the least about education. And I think, yeah, differentiating between testing and assessment is important. And the written test, I mean, we've got the written exam came to us via, I think, either Oxford or Cambridge during the Industrial Revolution. They used to be able to talk your way into your degree with a big audience. And if you came bottom, they lowered a wooden spoon down towards you as the loser, if you were the least successful one there. But it was an oral examination. And then industrial revolution, more people were coming in, pen and ink. We were able to sort of write our answers down. And so that's where that model came from.
Scale. I mean, it's about scale. I mean, how do you educate, you know, a vast number of people? And, you know, I put out a blog post about university as a service over the weekend. And this is like this idea about kind of how do you do lifelong learning, how do you scale up? And I suppose, you know, given the technology and the platform, the way of doing things that we had in the last century, you know, I would suggest that probably that was a way of doing it. I mean, you know, it was textbooks and mass testing to make sure that, you know, to test that the teachers were teaching correctly and that the kids could remember. You know, I mean, I think it creates some odd ideas. You know, we often have perhaps school leaders saying, well, our school is very good. I mean, 15% of our kids get an A or an A star. Well, that kind of means your school's broken, doesn't it? I mean, I couldn't say that to my customers, like 15% of my customers are happy. I mean, good grief. But I mean, I think, and it's interesting, I think, the pandemic as a sort of catalyst, I suppose, for thinking about some of these things. What could we do at internet scale? I mean, I'm not a big fan of what's happening online at the moment with learning and online teaching. I think it's just that idea of saying, okay, so it's like using iPads as a textbook. It doesn't change anything. And I think if we just use this online experience to virtualize real life experiences, I think that it impoverishes it, actually. I don't think it's as good as face-to-face for that kind of thing, but it's good at other things. And I do wonder then, is there a way of using these platforms in a way that has that scale that was being attempted in the last century, but relevant to the challenges that present and future learners are going to face, both in this century and the next? I mean, it's pretty, we think things are tough right now. They're going to get a lot tougher, aren't they? We're going to have to reinvent and redesign large parts of everything. So, we, by golly, I mean, we don't need less education. We need more education and better education, and education that could reach more people and make it more accessible. I mean, this education system certainly suits a lot of learners, but also there's a lot of learners that it doesn't.
Yeah.
And why try to, I mean, the beautiful thing about what's happening in terms of technological progress with AI and automation and everything else is we no longer have to try and program standardized humans. Actually, what matters is the humanity. So I think this is a great opportunity. It's a good time for change.
Yeah.
I don't think it means all the other stuff has to be thrown away. I think there's some value in a lot of that.
Yeah.
I just think it's become too much. I think it's, I think if getting through tests and content and subject mastery without application becomes the be all and end all of education, I think it's a shame. I mean, we end up with what a sort of Platonic learning, isn't it? Plato. Everything's a sort of abstract. The doing of things is somehow dirty, But Aristotle, I think, was right on this. I mean, it was about, applying that to things. Platonic learning, like Platonic in so many things, isn't that much fun.
You're using your long answers now, Graham. Well done.
Sorry, I'll stop.
Well, there's a question come through about it, and I haven't forgotten you, Martin. I will come to you. There's a question come through about the way in which technology can help learning be reimagined. And I think one of the things I mentioned at the beginning, if all of you heard that, my wife is an international school principal here in the Netherlands, where I'm based at the moment. And she just says it won't go back. Technology, the fact that they've put everything online so quickly, so suddenly it won't go back. They'll go back to school. But there are so many aspects of education that have now moved forward, and technology will be part of that. And a head teacher from secondary head from Bath, we were chatting to yesterday on these conversations, he was saying something similar. I said, what do you wish you'd have done in the past before it happened? If you could go back, he said, I would have spent 4 days of CPD training every teacher to use the technology for learning, not to replace the core element of the relational part of the work that we do, but because there is so much that we can do online now, whether you call it blended. We've got a conversation later on today with people like ICT evangelist Mark Anderson to explore more about the technology. But I think there's a real opportunity to get that blend right and to identify what are the things that the robots can do, that the teacher's doing at the moment, that we can pass over, and what are the things that the robots can't currently do that we need to hang on to. And I wrote a book a while back called Why Do I Need a Teacher When I've Got Google? And there are good answers to that, but you've got to have a good answer to what makes a good teacher in the 21st century. And I want to come back to Martin and just come back to this idea about sort of assessment and measuring and the tension between an education system that allows all to flourish and one that is designed to get certain ones to fail. We know through norm referencing that we've got to have only a certain number getting A grades or getting top grades, whatever the number might be, because we need people to achieve that. We need certain people to fail as well. So what are the tensions at teacher training level, Martin, as you prepare the future teachers? How do you help them deal with those sorts of tensions?
Good morning, everybody. At teacher training level, I would say that one of the tensions is that the theoretical part of the course, that the PGCE course that trainee teachers receive, doesn't often match up with what they're then asked to do in schools. Schools, on the whole, seem to me to be very much involved in this narrowed curriculum that is focused on the exams almost entirely. And at university, we are, or on my course, and certainly at Sheffield University as well, where I was lecturing last week, we're looking at holistic teaching. We are looking at experiential teaching. And what I see generally as I go around the country, not necessarily just in South Yorkshire, but across the country, is sort of passive receipt of what I call old knowledge. Things we already know, I tell them to you, and now you know them, and then you regurgitate them. And as you know, with any exam that any kid ever took, ever, the first thing they do after the exam is burn their books in the garden, and with it, the knowledge, knowledge in inverted commas, goes with it. And one of the findings that I have from writing Forget School in terms of the people who are taking these examinations is that presently they understand the value of them as being very limited. And I think that's largely because teachers have been gaming these exams with kids for at least a generation, maybe two. It's important, it's for your exam. Don't worry about it, it's just for the exam. Either of those thoughts limit the value of those things, and the young people, the 20 to 30-year-olds that I interviewed who make up the core of this book, were saying that actually when they're looking to employ other people, the exam and the qualification is the least of the qualities that they're looking for from these people. And I see all kinds of trainee teachers. I go and watch them teaching, and it's very much assessment objective focus. You'll see creative writing lessons called AO3, and the creative part of creative writing doesn't seem to be there. It's largely here's a list of 17 things that I need to see in your piece of writing so that you can jump through the hoop of the exam. I see a lot of examination of unseen text where it doesn't matter who was writing, why they were writing, when they were writing, what they thought they were doing with that writing. It's just straight into the mechanics of pulling it apart so that you can pass AO3, language, structure and form. And that is the tension in the continuing conversation of a PGCE course, is the ways in which that the trainees come back from school and they'll watch me or one of my guests or one of my colleagues talking through an exciting way of teaching. For instance, we had one of our associates, Jane Hewitt, a photographer, came in, and we looked at creativity in the English classroom, and we looked at photography as a stimulus for all sorts of writing. And the general comment from the trainees is, "This is great, Martin, this is great, Jane, this is great, but I'm not allowed to do it." And that's because of this tension where it strikes me a lot of the time that the kids are there for the school rather than the other way around, because the school has to look better than the one down the road. And you're exactly right about exams. If we're going to have losers, and we need a testing system where everybody can show their capacities and it be a positive. In Forget School, I suggest that maybe we get rid of examinations altogether and replace them with e-portfolios that record what children have achieved, that contains the library of their reading, that contains detail of their acumen in various things, the projects they've been involved with. And that in that way, everybody can turn up in the 21st century to an interview. And if you're going to be interviewed by the young people that I've been working with, it'll be in a coffee shop, and you'll need your portfolio with you, and you'll need to be personable. You'll need to be a people person. You'll need to fit in with the people that you're going to work with. You're going to need to show some initiative, some creative thinking, some independence, but also a capacity to collaborate. You're going to be confident. None of those things are on the curriculum. If you take confidence, for instance, I think one of the ways that schools can immediately act so that they don't get left behind is to write confidence into the curriculum. Find places to explicitly say, this is where we are developing confidence in children. That was the most disappointing chapter I had to write in my book, was the fact that most of those young people that I interviewed said they'd had to develop confidence after school. And that, I think, is largely to blame for that is this passivity, this sitting quietly noting down information. One of the people I interviewed brought with the papers, and they'd highlighted all the questions that they'd answered. And I guess at GCSE, this is a rounding up of their formal education from age 4 to 16. And the person showed me the questions, and then they'd made a list of them. When you looked at the list of the questions, that person described it, I think it was a rag bag of silliness.
A rag bag of silliness. That's poetry, and that's creative writing in itself, isn't it? A rag bag of silliness. The confidence thing is an interesting one. I know for the book we wrote a couple of years ago, The Working Class, a big collaborative independent thinking press book, the issue of confidence came through in a huge way, especially from people from poorer, from the writers who are from poorer socioeconomic backgrounds. You don't seem to, maybe it's a broad generalization, but confidence doesn't seem to be lacking so much in people who went to wealthier schools. But it's so important. For independent thinking, we tried to appoint apprentices to do some social media work for us last year, and we had 3 or 4 people we interviewed who had all the qualifications that we were looking for, but they just lacked confidence, and they lacked any sense of self or excitement or passion. And in the end, we just thought we can't, much as we'd like to gives an opportunity to a young person, they just would do more damage to independent thinking than good, really. Graham's got his hand up, and I want to explore your book a little bit more, Martin, with you in a minute. But Graham's got his hand up, and then I want to ask Graham something as well. Graham,
I just wanted to make a quick comment, really. I mean, the confidence thing, I think, is a really important thing. I mean, and also, just the notion of relationships. I mean, the Harvard longitudinal study, which is the longest study of what it takes to live well in the world. You can Google it, Harvard longitudinal study. What it said, it wasn't actually, what you earned or which university you went to or so forth. It was the quality of your relationships, how you are with your partners or neighbors or whatever. And I mean, like confidence, this isn't something that we typically see within schooling environments. And particularly in the UK and the sort of introduction to the EBAC and so forth, the erosion of the arts, particularly within the state system, from drama to performance and so forth, I think has diminished the opportunity to learn confidence. And people say, well, is drama that important? For example, I'm using drama. But, if we look at entrepreneurship, the communication of ideas, as someone who's created a number of fast growth startups, I've had to perform. I had to be confident in order to pitch my ideas both to clients and investors. It's a skill. And you touched on it briefly about how that wasn't being eroded perhaps in the independent or private school sector. And I don't think that's a coincidence. I think there is seen within those schools the value of these arts in terms of holistic education. And I think that there's a lot to do with the, as we've seen, this gearing towards measurement around, quote, academic subjects has effectively eroded interest in some of those things. And I think that is a real problem when we think about what is necessary for this century and beyond.
Thank you. One of the things I wanted to come to as well, and this is where's a really interesting overlap between what Martin was talking about and a conversation we had in a coffee shop in London a couple of years ago, where you were talking. I'd just come from a conference in I don't know, the side of the world, and there was a head teacher of an international school in China who was saying that his young people, they had the chance to do the IB, the International Baccalaureate examinations for 16 to 18 to get to university and beyond, or not. They could do it in a different way. And it overlaps a little bit with Martin's Eportfolio idea, which is what they were looking at, and then speaking directly with the universities to give validity to it. And then you talked about the idea of young people just doing their own thing, putting their stuff on GitHub, for example, or other ones that are out there, and then being able to say to employers or to potential customers, because it's not just about preparing young people to be employees, it's preparing them to be not just job seekers, job creators, as the phrase goes. Here's the work that I've done. Forget qualifications, that doesn't tell you anything, but here is actual genuine evidence work that I've done that's relevant and useful. Just tell us a little bit about that. We've got a lot of questions coming in, by the way, so hopefully we'll get to.
Super cool. Why don't I just briefly touch on that one? So for those that don't know GitHub, there's a couple of things in technology and in software engineering and so forth. There's a couple of these sites where if you're a software engineer, you go to show off your skills. I mean, likewise, there's now like Behance in the creative sectors and so forth. So there's a number of these different sites where you show like a portfolio of your work. So the reason why I use GitHub as an example was that, you know, I've in my career building fast growth startups, I mean, I easily employed more than 1,000 software engineers globally. And I have to say, I've rarely, if ever, looked at their qualifications, and not out of any snobbery, actually. I mean, it just didn't occur to me to look at their qualifications. What I looked at was, well, what can you do? And so I'd go onto sort of GitHub, which is where software engineers go to show off their voodoo. And there, you can see, okay, did your code work? Does it do it? What was your thinking around it? What was your creativity? How did you collaborate with others? How respected by others were you? Because people can download your code and ask you questions and so forth. That tells me much more about that software engineer's actual skills and capability. And then it comes down to, I think, what Martin was talking about earlier, which is, well, okay, can I work with you? Do I like you? Can you work with my team? And all those kinds of sort of human confidence type things. And I think that sort of is a pointer. I think these sort of GitHub systems, and there's a variety for different kinds of industries and so forth, where you can show your things. I think this points to something that perhaps could lead to some form of reform in education and schools in particular, but perhaps universities, where we get to see what's underneath the exams. Because, you know, I mean, it's an old, you know, metaphor is that the iceberg, you know, the tip is the stuff that we see at the moment, which is the sort of measurements and the grading and all that kind of business. That's fair enough. But there's so much more underneath. And how do we surface that? And I think, you know, employers, and indeed some universities, MIT, for example, you know, MIT are less bothered by your entrance qualifications than what you have done. I know that from my own interviews with MIT. So I think that to have some, and we are seeing those things. These aren't abstract. I mean, you know, from TikTok to YouTube and everything in between, we've seen ways of surfacing the kind of skills that you can do. Kids that make TikTok videos or YouTube videos are very competent at media production and are moving into mainstream television and feature film work. So this is an area of showing things. I think it's how can we embrace that? If we're thinking about schools operating at internet scale, what can we learn from some of those assessment systems that we can pull in and use wisely, like GitHub or Stack Overflow, for example?
Thank you for that. Martin, that ties in very nicely, I think, with your book. Talk to us about some of the people that you were interviewed. What made you write that book? Talk about some of the people who you've interviewed and how they agreed with you about forgetting school.
I don't know that I had a central aim going forward, other than I was troubled by the exam-centric nature of what was going on in schools, and the way that was, it seemed to me, leaving a generation uneducated, if that's the right word. But actually what I found was a generation of people who are educating themselves online. So, for instance, I made a film for you 3 or 4 years ago called The Only Fresh Air is Outside in the Yard. And that, the filmmaker was a young man who just taught himself to make films using YouTube, bought himself a drone, and is now hugely successful, you know, getting clips on BBC and all sorts of things. And he just taught himself and just gone with a practicality that he was enthusiastic about. What I noticed was the huge increase. I have 2 sons who are 25 and a daughter who's 22 now. And what I was noticing with them and with their colleagues is that the notion of employment is vastly changed. When I left school, you know, you saw the careers advisor, you decided what you were going to be, and society was telling you that's what you would always be. So if you decided you were going to be a policeman, the vision that you saw was being a policeman, you know, for your 30-year stint. And young people don't operate like that anymore. They move from contract to contract, opportunity to opportunity. There's a not only is there a huge growth in self-employment, but there's a huge growth in people who are working jobs on the way to being self-employed. You know, and things that used to be an enthusiasm are now seen more. The young people see the potential to do those things. So, for instance, I spoke to a number of musicians, some of whom, or most of whom, are working other jobs. My son would be a good example. He wasn't somebody I interviewed, but he'd be a good example of somebody who's working social media for a company that sells retro football shirts and hats. He is the host of a music night at Rock City in Nottingham, and he works in a music studio. But he's doing all of those things while he pursues his interest in becoming a musician. I spoke to a couple of graphic designers as well. And there again, there's a particular instance of people who need a portfolio. That's how you get it. That's how you get a job. That's how you get the next contract. And what we're seeing is, I think, a stagnation of curriculum when the world has moved on. I mean, maybe when I left school, maybe it was reasonable in 1980 schmerty to anticipate that the education you'd had would last you a lifetime. But that hasn't turned out to be true. For instance, I have an O-level in computer studies from 1984, possibly Britain's most useless qualification. And actually, you have to learn, you have to unlearn, and you have to relearn. And this is a process that young people, in whatever they're doing, are going to have to do. So one of the graphic designers was working with one company, went to another, and was moving from Mac to some other system, and was having to relearn systems so that he could do the work that he was doing. The young also that I interviewed were pretty fed up of people employing them, taking all their good ideas, making a lot of money out of it, and paying them not very much. And a number of people, there was a theme in that book, I can do better than this. And the atmosphere out there is that if you can give it a go, that it's possible. There is the potential to do these things. Largely driven, I think, by the internet and the fact that you can actually publish music. You don't, up to Spotify, and you'll get loads of hits, you'll get interest. You can move through local music scenes and make music, for instance, as an example, in the way that if you were in a band in 1970s or 80s, you had no chance. Or even if you did, it wasn't something that was seen as a serious potential means of making a living. Mm. And I think increasingly, because when you're making your living over the internet in the way that a lot of the people that I interviewed were. So let's take the example of the wedding designer that I spoke to. She said 95% of her work comes through Instagram. And, you know, if we three on the screen, we're all going to be wedding designers, we're all offering the same service. And if you're buying that service on Instagram, it's going to be the way that it's going to be, whether Graham or Ian or Martin presents himself better. They're going to be buying into you. They're going to be buying into that person. And the wedding designer I spoke to said when she left school and then dropped out of Falmouth College, the design place, she said for a couple of years she tried to make her wedding design business corporate and impressive, you know, writing to persuade that she'd learnt at school, I suppose, and just about broke even. But once she started, if you excuse my expression, selling herself, her sales rocketed. Here's me tie-dyeing the bunting for the Far From the Madding crowd. Here's me making the piratey display for the pirate wedding. Here I am doing yoga. And actually knowing how to manicure your Instagram account would be a much better use of the English curriculum than writing a letter to a friend, which is only going to get you bullied these days because young people don't do that. Or writing a newspaper article. Where are the young people that read newspapers? They don't exist.
Yeah, they read the covers on the internet maybe. I want to come back to this idea of, and I know Graham's got something to say about this, sort of the economy. And I mentioned the idea of jobs. Oh, by the way, O-level in computer studies in my school back in 18 Schmerty, O-level computer studies was introduced before the school had computers. So it was purely writing stuff in a textbook, I seem to remember.
We had one link to Newcastle University and there were like 4 buttons bigger than the size of your head that you could push. That was about it.
Muhammad Yunus is an economist from Bangladesh who I think won a Nobel Prize for his work around microcredit, and he wrote a book called The Four Zeros, and it was in that, so zero unemployment, zero poverty, zero pollution, I don't know what the one is, but he talks about job seekers and job creators, and the role of education is to not just push out the job seekers, the people who have got these qualifications, have an interview, go into a system, but can actually create jobs. And he links that then with things like the environment you've got and local and local independent work, if you like. Here's a local problem and here's local people and let's put them together and let's grow a business out of that. And I saw research just 2 weeks ago, new research that came out that showed that NGOs and sort of non-profit focused small or local organizations actually in the long run employed more people than these large for-profit organizations. So this opportunity to really do things at a grassroots level and tap into the sorts of movements that you're talking about. And I don't mention the environment lightly because I want to come back to Graham about your sort of your Malaysian epiphany, Graham, and the education system that's linked with the economy and how we must have a new economy because the planet can't sustain the old one. What are the implications for teaching there? And then hopefully that we'll be able to sort of squeeze through some of the questions that are coming through. A lot of them are about what are the real skills we need to be, whether it's primary or secondary, we really need to be putting into people. How can we teach communication? What are the not for sale things that we're going to hang on to now, whether that's in technology or outside? But just education. And Tom Peters, the business guru, once wrote, education is economics, economics is education. The two are linked. How do you portray that now, Graham?
Yeah, I mean, I think my epiphany was, for a long time, I've railed against people from the OECD and other various economists at global education summits because of this sort of link between the economy and the economic outcomes against investment in education. And so for a long time, I railed against this idea that the purpose of education was to produce human capital for the economic development plan. My answer was no. Education is to provide present and future generations with the knowledge and skills for them to thrive in a rapidly transforming world. Now, I liked my version, but the epiphany I had when I was in Malaysia, I was giving a talk there, and in the morning it was nice and sunny, and in the afternoon the clouds went dark. It was like monsoon, and I'm seeing this massive storm and the sea raging, and the storm drains were like leaking out single-use plastic bottles into the sea and everything else. As I was reading in the New York Times a report which I'd already had access to a couple of years earlier, but had just been released into the public domain, that showed the place where I was sitting in a hotel in Malaysia would be underwater in 20 years' time, as would large parts of the sort of Southeast Asian region. And then I was thinking, wow, okay, what are we going? This is before the pandemic, so this is towards the end of last year, and I'm thinking, how bad does it have to get before we change? I mean, you know, we think about the pandemic, but this is the latest in a long line of warnings about the way we use our world. And you know, not 2019, I mean, Australia on fire, for example. I mean, you know, sheets of ice coming off our time. I mean, there was lots of records that were broken last year in terms of even before the pandemic. So I'm sitting there thinking about this, what will make us change? And then it dawned on me that actually maybe the economists were right. Maybe it's the economy that is creating this damage. You know, maybe the actual purchase, the actual cost isn't built into the purchase price of our economic model. So what might change it? And then I'm thinking, okay, if I accept that economist's argument about the economy and that education's role is like other structures in society, like mass media, judicial system, political and so forth, to maintain the status quo, i.e. the economic model. What happens if the economic model shifts? And of course, the economic model shifting, I think, that's a structural reform. And we don't have those very often. We usually get structural reforms as a result of war, revolution, or catastrophe. And it strikes me that we're heading towards the latter. And so what then changes? And my feeling was then, okay, there's a couple of things happening at the moment, a few things that are converging that makes this could be the moment. And this, bearing in mind, this was before the pandemic. One was the fourth industrial revolution. We already have, we will have powerful AIs, automation, and so forth, which shifts the nature of learning and work. Existential challenges, which we're seeing at the moment, climate change, population growth, disease, and pandemics, and so forth. These are massive challenges which aren't going to go away after this pandemic. But then the optimism came from Generation Z. You know, Generation Z, there's 2.5 billion 9 to 34-year-olds in the world. And they are, you know, in many ways like regular teenagers, but they do have a plan to save the earth. And I think the influence of that generation, both on their parents like myself, I have 2 Generation Z kids, but also generations coming through, what they buy, and this is the largest consumer group of all time, what they buy and what they consume will determine what happens next. And so the forces of the economy will then shift. So my suggestion was that there's a possibility that we could move from what has been a linear and extractive economy, where we take things out of the earth, we much them up, turn them into plastic, use them once, throw them away, into something that is much more circular or regenerative in terms of economy, because the economy at the end of the day has to support the inhabitants, has to support society and so forth. And the only way to do that would be through regenerative. We can't, economists, you know, we're talking about opening the economy now, but economies have always killed people. Unfortunately, these extractive economies do end up with exploitation of people, and people die, and the damage to our planet. I think we're getting to the point where we know that we can build, we can design an economy, reimagine an economy that is regenerative and add something back. Now, if that does happen, and I do get it, it's hopelessly idealistic and optimistic. But if we do that, it does mean that we will have to redesign and reinvent everything. And then we think about STEM education or STEAM education. These are interdisciplinary. It's only when you put them together. And just like, you know, with the portfolios that Martin was talking about, STEAM and STEM, to show your ability in those subjects, to create something, to make something, to show, you know, to solve some of these problems, I think is where we could be going. So I think if we do head towards that, I mean, the alternative, of course, is that we don't have a regenerative economy, carry on with an extractive economy. I suspect it won't end well. So my feeling is we do have this opportunity to shift. And I think if the economy shifts, then we see education change, because education doesn't change the economy. The economy is the base. It's the the foundation of society. And I think that is what drives all the other structures in order to support it. And we're seeing that now, of course. As we're trying to open the economy, the education structure is coming back and going, okay, yes, we must do this. It's interesting how those sort of things work. So my money is on the regenerative economy, and I think that will have a profound impact on what and how we learn.
Right. Okay. Wow. Thank you for that. Let me just a question for Martin, and it ties in. You talked about STEM and STEAM. The extra A there is around the arts. So, Martin, aren't the education requirements of creative and communication skills totally different to the need for a foundation in STEM subjects? What's your experience, Martin, in because most of or many of the examples you give link to the creative industries, whether it's dressmaking or filmmaking. What's your experience within STEM, and where does STEM and STEAM sort of fit together for you?
I can't hear you.
Ooh.
Sorry.
Can you hear me now? You can't hear anything. Okay, that's strange. When we can hear you. Okay, you can't hear anything? Shake your head. No, nothing. No, nothing. Okay. All right, I'll come back to Graham. We'll try and work out, maybe Nina in the background, working in mysterious ways, can try and work out what's happened to Martin's speaker. I think the rest of us, Graham, you can hear me, can't you?
Yes, I can.
Yeah, okay. All right, well, we'll come back to you and we'll see whether we can rescue Martin before the end.
Your question was around STEAM and STEM, I think.
Well, yeah, go on then. You have a go at that one. I was going to ask you, well, what do you think, what are the 3 key skills that we drill right from reception all the way through, and this relates to some of the questions that we've got that will save the world. But just link that with STEAM first, then, while we're sort of marking that.
Well, I mean, I think there are a number of things that we need to know, in terms of critical thinking, collaboration, and creativity, and a whole variety of things that we need. And I think that you build those into for example, I think project-based learning has an opportunity here in the case of those sort of STEM, STEAM type areas. To actually take those things that you're learning in these different areas and then bringing them together in the creation of something, whether it's a hydroponic garden for food security or a musical instrument that you're building and designing, you end up not only having to learn those different disciplines and interdisciplinaries, you're then applying them into creating something. And that's the exhibition of the creation and the demonstration of something, perhaps in a communicated video or what have you, or through GitHub and so forth, is a way of demonstrating that learning. But I think Martin's come back online now, so we should give him a chance to respond.
Can you hear us now, Martin?
I can. What am I responding to?
Yes, okay. I was asking about the STEM-STEAM connection, because one of the questions was how many of the education requirements of creative and communication skills, aren't they different for what you might find in STEM subjects? So bearing in mind that some of your examples were from the creative industries, how does it lie in with more science-based, and where does STEAM fit in for you?
No, I took the examples weren't the ones that I've mentioned today have been arts-based, haven't they? But I spoke to a dentist, a doctor, an architect. I suppose that's art as well, isn't it? I think we need. I mean, some of the things that need to be taught are things like critical thinking, the capacity to develop some cognitive flexibility, to be creative in thinking, to be able to manage people. Not even because you're the boss, just because you've got to manage your relationships at work. Levels of emotional intelligence are going to be important. Those are preparations for work, regardless of whether you're working in science or in the arts.
And these are all things. I mean, people are saying, what skills can we embed in primary schools from reception through to year 6 and beyond? Those things that you described, critical thinking, creativity, emotional intelligence, that we can build, even if we're working within the traditional school confines and the curriculum and the testing system, we can still do it in a way that develops critical thinking, creativity. And
there was a question earlier from Elizabeth Hamilton Thorpe about getting rid of SATs and doing something else. And I think, I mean, you know, the year six sats, let's take the SPAG test, for instance, is something that is part of the status quo that needs to go, and that technology will remove because it will become obsolete. You know, that spelling, punctuation and grammar in 15 years time will be your conversation with your AI machine about where you want the text, where you want the images, and when you want the sound to come in. It'll have nothing to do with the niceties of where words are put, because you know your devices will do grammar for you. You know, I think increasingly writing, communicating is going to be about speaking to your AI device. And when you finish speaking, you'll say standard British grammar, please, and it'll be done for you. Or you'll say Mandarin Chinese, please, and it'll be done for you. And I don't think that's too many years away. So the conversation about the structures of writing and about reading and writing is going to change. And of course, at the minute, the government, because they don't trust teachers, has got rid of the speaking and listening component of the GCSE. So how can children value their ability to talk, which is going to be the main of those skills, I suspect, in the coming years?
Okay, we're running against the clock. I want to come back to Graham one final time. Again, Sugata Mitra, one of the things he talks about is that moving away from the 3 R's towards possibly, he says, the 3 C's of computation, comprehension and communication. And I think there's a lot there that we can unpick with regard to the conversation that we've just had. So thank you for that, Martin. Graham, final question for you, just briefly. From outside of the world of education, what reassurance would you give? And we've got a lot of people in the Q&A, and I think in the text as well, who really want to make a difference, really want to make a change, and really want to move things forward. What reassurance would you give them from your position, Graham?
So reassurance in terms of
that what they feel is the right way for education to go, and the things that they need to do, and the new skills that need to be developed beyond the passing of tests is the right thing to do.
Yeah, I mean, I think you know, I'm constantly, I'm optimistic actually. I think if you have children, you have to be. You know, I mean, there's been a meme going around that I think is quite funny, which is, you know, we have to reopen the schools because kids will start thinking for themselves. You know, I'm constantly impressed by our young people, that despite, you know, the fact that we're putting them through a particularly, you know, in some cases rigid education system, which might not be suitable for them, they continue to learn and do things. I mean, you know, the thing around putting these sort of online teaching systems into the home very rapidly, and this is no disrespect to any of the teachers that are working very hard to do this and so forth. The fact is that they are using these technologies quite often to learn and to create and to make things. We see it on so many of their social media platforms every day. I mean, we like to think, well, you know, constantly looking at Instagram or constantly, these are major communication systems that they are using. You know, I think as that generation come to power, as they vote, as they make decisions and so forth, I think we are heading towards a better world. And I think what we do is, you know, and I think good teachers do anyway, beyond the materials that we have to teach, is to be that person that's on the side, to be that person that, you know, this isn't new. This goes back to Paulo Freire in the Pedagogy of the Oppressed. I mean, you are a co-learner. Teaching is relational. You know, we've shown that just doing it over a screen and so forth isn't the same thing. It's about the human thing. It's about this combination between AI and humans. Maintain the relational nature is what happens in the room. Okay, all right, thank you. That optimism will have to end there. And any mention of Paulo Freire, F-R-E-I-R-E, Freire, great Brazilian educator, is worth it. It was a good one to end with. Thank you for that. In the previous conversation, Graham, I heard you talk about a golden age of creativity and opportunity that we're working towards. And I think that is such a positive thing to come out of
the awfulness that's been going on, both with the with COVID and with all the challenges that the world is facing. So a golden age of creativity awaits. Thank you, Graham, ever so much. Brilliant as ever. Martin, thank you ever so much.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, everybody, for coming on. Thank you for Nina working in the background there. Remember, put some money in the buckets of NHS Relief Project or Winston's Wish or The Big Issue or RSPB. At ITL Worldwide, if you want to carry on the conversation, in independentthinking.co.uk. If you want to make contact directly, check out the website, independentthinking.com or independentthinkingpress.com if you want Martin's book, 30% off, use CPD 30 or 50%, use VAT 50, and it's an ebook because they've just knocked the VAT off ebooks. Check out our blogs, any other way we can help, just get in touch. And thank you very much again. Thank you all.